Hi again, Professor Stein here with part three of our week 10 on religion and empire in modern East Asia. Right now, we're talking about the second reading, Buddhist Christmas, a chapter from Hwansoo Kim's great book on the transnational Buddhist empire during the colonial period. So, we see here some pictures of the Hana Matsuri, the flower festival in present day Japan, where this sweet little statue of the baby Buddha is being bathed in either water or sometimes sweet tea. Uh, and it's very much kind of a child oriented festival. There's a lot of cute stuff. The Buddha is also represented by a white elephant, which you might remember from his birth story. He's pointing up and down. If you might remember when he was first born, he took 7 steps, and from every footstep, a lotus blossomed. And he said, "There's never been anyone like me, under heaven or on the earth." So, and this is his last incarnation. So, this is kind of a celebration of different aspects of his birth. Um, and in other parts of East Asia, it's celebrated in maybe a bit more serious way. Here's a photo from Vietnam, where a number of monastics, I think nuns here, are reciting sutras, but also in a fun way too. Here's a photo from present day Seoul, and you can see this woman taking a selfie in front of some colorful lanterns that have pictures, cartoon pictures of the baby Buddha on them. So this idea of the Buddhist Christmas as a kind of a fun, family-oriented, child-oriented Buddhist version of the gift giving and the lights of Christmas is a very modern practice. And so in this chapter, Kim looks at how these types of celebrations were established in the British and Japanese empires around the turn of the 20th century. And he shows that Buddhists were trying to modernize their religion to compete with Christianity and demonstrate how Buddhism was relevant in the modern world. He was showing how these celebrations were centered around Buddhism as key to both national identity, including in Ceylon and Korea, which were colonies at the time. So the national identity would have been kind of anti colonial, and also as a symbol of Pan Asian solidarity. So that's between the colonial government of Japan and these colonies, interestingly. And also interestingly, the colonial governments, like the British in Ceylon, today Sri Lanka, and the Japanese in Korea, sponsored the festival to try and improve relationships with the colonized Buddhist subjects while Christian missionaries protested. The Korean case, particularly, which Kim focuses on, shows how the festival became a site for both Koreans to assert their own national identity, while also the colonial authorities were trying to Japanize Korean Buddhist practice. And we also saw that in the Taiwan case in the first reading. Okay, so just a quick overview. Vesak, which is the traditional name for the holiday, was first reinstated as a public holiday in British Ceylon, from which it influenced the rise of this celebration in Japan. Koreans had been celebrating it for quite some time, but it had kind of lost its Buddhist meaning. We'll talk about that in a little bit, and it regained that around the turn of the 20th century. In Japan, this flower festival, or Hana Matsuri, was very successful, and thereafter it kind of exported that new modern version of this traditional Buddhist festival to its colonies in Taiwan and Korea. Okay, so let's take a look at a little bit more detail at how all this went down. First, the British started rule in Ceylon, which we today call Sri Lanka, around 1815, and at that time they had began suppression of Buddhism. But by the late 19th century, particularly in the 1860s, there was a big Buddhist revival movement, and so in order to compete with Christian missionization, Buddhists formed publishing houses, schools, Sunday schools, youth groups, and two of the major people involved in these movements, who were also involved in the revival of Vesak, are these two guys kind of on the right side of this photograph. In the center, you see Anagarika Dharmapala, uh, who was kind of the protege of this white American with the big beard on the right named Henry Steele Olcott, who is a very enthusiastic Buddhist reformer. And so these two met, and some other of their colleagues met with colonial authorities, the British colonial authorities in the 1880s, to get them to remove the ban from Vesak, which had been banned since 1815. And Vesak was a Buddhist festival on the May full moon, so the 15th day of the fourth month on the lunar calendar, that celebrated Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and death. Although it did come to be, as we mentioned, called kind of the Buddha's birthday, a kind of Buddhist Christmas, if you will, which is a term that Henry Steele Olcott used for it, which became more widely used, including in Korea later on. So, as a result of their efforts, the British authorities legalized Vesak in 1884, and it began being celebrated with a lot of things we associate with Christmas, exchanging cards, singing carols, gifts. There's also a parade, and they also used it as a way to promote the Buddhist flag that Olcott had been involved in designing, that we also see in the last reading for this that we're talking about this week, becomes a big deal in the Vietnamese Buddhist movement after World War II. And the Buddhist flag is also very visible in Japan, partly as a result of these connections that they talk about, that Kim talks about in this reading. Okay, so yeah, in the 1890s, Vesak becomes a very popular Ceylonese national holiday, kind of a symbol of their Buddhist identity. There's big parades. As I mentioned, the Christian missionaries complain about it. And Olcott and Dharmapala traveled to Japan in 1889, and Dharmapala returns in 1902, and they're promoting Buddha's birthday, the Buddhist flag. Dharmapala actually is asked by Buddhist youth groups that were encouraged by Olcott and Dharmapala on their tour to come back to Japan to help celebrate the Japanese Buddha's birthday festival, which was not yet called Hana Matsuri in Japan. And here's a picture, I think, of a bit of a later festival. This is in Hibiya Park in Tokyo. But we see Indian delegates, as well as the front figure appears to be a Japanese man wearing an Indian-style turban, but with flowers. And this is some celebration of Buddha's birthday, or maybe a little bit later, Hana Matsuri in Hibiya Park in Tokyo. Which is a very interesting image I found online. So, why did Vesak become the flower festival? Well, there are some talk of flowers in the traditional Buddha birth story. Flowers fall from the sky, flowers spring up from the ground when he takes his steps. But actually, there's another transnational connection. So Anasaki Masaharu was a student of Japanese Buddhism and also religious studies, who was studying in Berlin at the turn of the 20th century. And he and a couple of other Japanese students organized a celebration of Buddha's birthday. And it happened to line up with Easter, which apparently is also known in German as Blumenfest, which means flower festival. So they called their celebration of Buddha's birthday, which they were inspired by from their Buddhist youth group days back in Japan, as Blumenfest, which they called in Japanese Hana Matsuri, flower festival. So when they returned to Japan, where Anasaki ended up teaching religious studies at the University of Tokyo, he was the very first such professor there, the phrase caught on in Japan. And so starting in 1916, the Hana Matsuri became a modern spectacle like it had in British Ceylon, including an air show, parade, bands playing music, everyone wearing flowers. And it grew into Tokyo's signature festival with stores having annual sales. The streets would be lined in flower petals. Big floats in the parade, fireworks, and Japan encouraged other Asian countries to adopt it, particularly China, but there were some conflicts about the calendar. Because as we know from our readings from last week, the lunar calendar was traditionally used for Buddhist festivals, but the Japan used the Gregorian calendar, the Western calendar. So they celebrated on April 8th, which they encouraged everyone else to do, as it was traditionally celebrated on the 8th day of the fourth month of the lunar calendar. But the Chinese and elsewhere in East Asia wanted to continue celebrating it on the lunar calendar, so it would be sometime in May. Um, so in Korea, they had long celebrated this lantern festival on the 8th day of the fourth lunar month, but they had kind of lost its Buddhist meaning. Traditionally, there had been sutras chanted and people would visit the temples, but over time in Korea, it became more secularized. It was kind of a kids' holiday. The people would still maybe visit some temples to pray for the safety of their family, but it was very commercialized and very child oriented. But in the early 20th century, with some of this influence from Sri Lanka or Ceylon and from Japan, it became re-Buddhicized, and temples hosted big celebrations. These celebrations got even bigger after Korea was annexed by Japan in 1910, as the train lines out into the countryside that were built allowed tens of thousands of people to attend celebrations at these remote temples, even staying overnight, and train companies offered special discounts. So, let's see. But what happened was in the 1910s, Japan's rule was very strict, and there became tension between the Koreans and the Japanese rulers, which came to a head in 1919, where there were big protests demanding Korean independence. So in the 1920s, Japan was eager to kind of relieve some of those tensions and enhance the the what am I looking for? The kind of understanding that Japan and Korea shared a particular cultural heritage. So they use this Hana Matsuri to try to bring together the two cultures around their shared Buddhism, particularly because it was a very fun holiday and it was kind of family oriented. It was something where they were trying to bridge the two cultures. But there was a big disagreement, as you could imagine, about which calendar to use, the Japanese wanting to have it on April 8th, and the Koreans wanting to use the lunar calendar, which they'd had traditionally their Lantern Festival on. And for a number of reasons, if you want to read the article, it's pretty interesting. The Koreans won this round of the battle. So the first Hana Matsuri in Korea was held in 1928. It was a huge party. They had an airplane showering the city in flower petals, so resembling the birth story of the Buddha. Event flyers also fell out of the sky. They had fireworks and ceremonies. And they had three sites, which was very symbolic because the northern part of the city was where the Koreans lived. The southern part of the city was where the Japanese lived. So they had different Korean Buddhist and Japanese Buddhist ceremonies at those two sites. And then they came together in the center kind of as a symbolization of the linkages between their two cultures. So this was a great success for about a decade. And then in 1937, which you might remember from the Taiwan reading, is when World War II really started in East Asia, when Japan attacked China, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, attacks on Shanghai and Nanking, really terrible losses on the Chinese side and massacres, um, atrocities committed by the Japanese military. And so at this point in 1937, Japan really wanted to Japanize the citizens of its overseas colonies. And so they changed the date to the solar date, which doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but it really was a big deal. A lot of Koreans were mad about it. It stopped being as popular as it was. And at the same time, the Korean Buddhists continued to use this festival, this flower festival, as a way of asserting the independent identity of Korean Buddhism as a national symbol, and to kind of rally people around the idea that Korean Buddhism was actually the mother of Japanese Buddhism. So thanks so much for listening and for your participation question. Just if you could write a little bit, particularly about Korea, but also if you want to talk about Japan or Ceylon as well. There's a lot about this in the reading. Just a question about how the rise of this celebration of Buddha's birthday or the flower festival, the Hana Matsuri, related to nationalism and colonialism. Thanks so much for listening, and I got one more video coming up.